What if humanity's oldest spiritual stories weren't simply trying to explain the world? What if they were quietly preserving a way of seeing it and ourselves within it? Across thousands of years, cultures separated by oceans, languages, and centuries have told remarkably different stories. Different gods, different symbols, different rituals, different understandings of the divine. And yet, despite those differences, many of these stories seem to return to surprisingly similar movements. Some people see those similarities as coincidence. Others point to cultural exchange. Some believe human beings naturally return to the same questions about life, suffering, hope, and transformation. And still others believe that these stories may each preserve part of a deeper reality, expressed through different symbols and traditions. Whether any of those explanations are correct isn't the question we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to do something much simpler. Over the last two episodes, we've watched forests renew and we've watched civilizations rebuild. Today, let's walk through a few of humanity's oldest spiritual stories and ask a different question. Why do so many of them seem to preserve remarkably similar movements of renewal? Not to flatten them, and not to suggest that they all mean the same thing, but to simply notice what each one might illuminate when placed beside one another. Perhaps by the end, we'll notice a melody that's been quietly waiting for us all along. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. Long before the phoenix became one of the world's most recognizable symbols of renewal, there was another bird. In ancient Egypt, stories spoke of the Bennu, a sacred bird closely associated with the rising sun, creation, and the continued renewal of life. Rather than emphasizing destruction, the Bennu often represented emergence, the beginning of a new cycle, the return of life after what appeared to be ending. Centuries later, Greek writers would tell a different story. A magnificent phoenix living for hundreds of years. As the end of its life approached, it carefully prepared its own nest. When the time came, the old life gave way to the new. In later traditions, the phoenix would become famous for rising from its ashes, transforming into one of history's most enduring symbols of renewal. The stories aren't identical. Each tradition tells the story in its own way. And yet, across centuries, they seem to preserve our remarkably similar movement. Not simply that life continues, but that renewal sometimes requires transformation. Perhaps that's why this image has endured for thousands of years, because it quietly suggests something many people instinctively recognize: that endings are not always the opposite of beginnings. Sometimes they are the doorway through which beginnings arrive. Perhaps that's the deeper question these stories preserve. Why do so many generations continue telling stories in which apparent endings become unexpected beginnings. Not because everyone answers that question in the same way, but because they continue finding it worth asking. Not every story of renewal begins with the world changing. Sometimes it begins with the way we see the world. Across many spiritual traditions, wisdom isn't always described as something entirely new. More often, it's described as something remembered. In the Buddhist tradition, awakening isn't about becoming someone else. It's about seeing reality more clearly, free from the illusions and attachments that had obscured it. In Plato's famous allegory of the cave, a prisoner steps into the light after being kept in a cave lit only by fire, where he watched shadows on the wall. This is everything he knows about reality. Shadows on the wall. In stepping out, he discovers that what once seemed like the whole of reality was only a shadow of something greater. The world hasn't changed. His perception has. Mystical traditions across culture often describe a similar movement. A veil lifts, what was hidden becomes visible, not because it suddenly appeared, but because it was no longer overlooked. These stories aren't identical. Each tradition understands awakening in its own way, and yet they seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. That wisdom isn't always invented. Sometimes it is remembered. Perhaps that's why these stories have endured, because they invite a question that reaches beyond any one tradition. Why do so many generations describe the deepest forms of wisdom as something rediscovered rather than newly created? Not because everyone answers that question the same way, but because it continues inviting us to look again. And perhaps that's one of renewal's quietest invitations. Not simply to become someone new, but to see with new eyes. Not every story of renewal begins with seeing differently. Sometimes it begins by walking through what feels like an ending. In one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, the Sumerian goddess Inanna descends through the 7 gates into the underworld. At each gate, she leaves something behind. One by one, the symbols of her identity are removed until she stands with nothing left to carry. Only then does the story begin to move toward return. In ancient Egypt, the story of Osiris tells of a king whose body is scattered across the land. Rather than surrendering to despair, Isis, his consort, patiently gathers what has been broken, holding hope that restoration is still possible. In Greek tradition, Persephone returns each spring, her story becoming intertwined with the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Winter gives way to spring. Absence gives way to return. In the Christian tradition, the story of Christ moves through suffering, death, and resurrection, becoming for many believers a pattern of hope and a path through which life is understood anew. Centuries later, Joseph Campbell observed that countless myths from around the world seem to preserve a remarkably similar movement. The hero leaves the familiar, passes through trial, is transformed, and returns carrying something that can be shared with others. These stories are profoundly different. Each belongs to its own culture, history, and understanding of reality. And yet, they seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. That transformation is rarely described as avoiding the passage. More often, it's found by moving through it. Perhaps that's why these stories have endured for so long. Not because they remove suffering, but because they refuse to let suffering have the final word. Why do so many generations continue preserving stories in which renewal follows what appears to be an ending? Not because everyone answers that question in the same way, but because it continues inviting us to hope that endings are not always the end of the story. Not every story of renewal ends with survival. Many of them imagine something even deeper: restoration. In the Christian book of Revelation, the final vision isn't simply one of judgment. It is a vision of a new heaven and a new earth, a renewed creation, a place where tears are wiped away, brokenness is healed, and the relationship between humanity and the divine is restored. In Hindu traditions, vast cycles of time unfold across ages. Worlds rise and pass away, not as meaningless repetition, but as part of an ongoing rhythm through which renewal remains possible. In Norse tradition, even after Ragnarok, the great ending of the gods, a green world emerges again. Life continues. A new generation steps forward. Among the Hopi, stories speak of humanity emerging into new worlds, each inviting a deeper relationship with creation and a different way of living within it. In the Hebrew prophets, restoration appears again and again. Dry bones receive breath. Exiles return home. Communities are gathered. Hope is renewed. These stories are profoundly different. Each imagines the future through its own language, symbols, and sacred traditions. And yet, they seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. That renewal isn't simply about continuing, it is about becoming more whole. Perhaps that's why these visions continue to endure, because they don't merely imagine that life goes on. They imagine that what has been broken can somehow be restored. Why do so many generations continue preserving stories that move toward wholeness rather than mere survival? Not because everyone answers the question in the same way, but because it continues inviting us to imagine that the deepest future isn't simply longer life. It may be deeper relationship. Not every story of renewal asks us to admire what happened long ago. Some of them seem to ask us something much more personal. How will we respond? Across these stories, different cultures preserve different symbols, different languages, different understandings of the divine. And yet, again and again, they seem to return to remarkably familiar invitations to notice, to awaken, to persevere, and to hope, to participate in renewal rather than merely observe it. Perhaps that's why these stories have endured for thousands of years. Not because they tell us exactly what to believe, but because they continue inviting each generation to ask new questions. What needs renewing in the way I see the world? What have I forgotten that may be worth remembering? What passage am I resisting that could become a place of transformation? What relationships might still be capable of healing? These aren't questions anyone can answer for us. Each of us walks that journey in our own way. Perhaps that's why renewal appears so often across nature, history, and humanity's oldest spiritual stories. Not because they erase our differences, but because they invite us to participate in one of life's oldest possibilities. To keep listening, to keep learning, to keep noticing, and perhaps to remain open to the possibility that reality still has something to teach us. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. My memoir, There's Still a Path Forward, is available. The link is in the description. And I'll see you next week.